So in the second video for our second week, I'm going to talk about analytical reading. So last week we talked about inspectional reading, which is when you preview what a text is about by looking at the title, table of contents, and you're focused on finding the big idea. You don't necessarily read everything in the text, maybe just introductions and conclusions, and you're kind of reading quickly or with a time limit. All right, this is different from analytical reading, which we're going to cover this week and next week. All right, so analytical reading, you're reading in depth for detail and for understanding. You're also reading the whole text, and you're reading this time without any time constraints. Okay, so you're reading maybe a little more leisurely than you were for inspectional reading. So one analogy that Adler and Van Doren give in How to Read a Book that I want to focus on is this analogy of the skeleton versus the flesh. Okay, because this is the first time where we start to see where reading and writing connect. Okay, so Adler and Van Doren say on page 75, every book has a skeleton hidden between its covers. Your job as an analytical reader is to find it. Okay, so that's kind of what you were doing last week with inspectional reading. You were trying to see how is a book structured and put together. Okay, so let's go over to another quote that Adler and Van Doren give on page 90. The reader tries to uncover the skeleton that the book conceals. The author starts with the skeleton and tries to cover it up with flesh. All right, so think of it this way. The skeleton is just the basic structure. It's kind of like the outline. And then the flesh is kind of all the little examples and details that cover up that skeleton. So if you were to write a paper, the skeleton would be the outline that your teacher might have you do before you turn in the paper. And then the flesh is all of the research and the quotes and the facts and everything that you put into that outline to, build it up into an actual paper. Okay? So this is why good reading and good writing go hand in hand, is because if you can understand how, as a reader, the author that you're reading, how they built their article or book, how they outlined it and how they added flesh to it, you can then learn to mimic that and do that same thing in your own writing. Okay, so what is the purpose of analytical reading? And I gave you that a little bit earlier, but basically it's all focused around understanding the author's argument. So that's the first. The second purpose is to really understand the details or nuances of the author's argument, and that's a little different from what you were doing with inspectional reading. The third is to understand how the author structured their argument, kind of in more detail. So analytical reading is always going to build off of inspectional reading. And then fourth, this is new, you need to now understand the specific terminology that your author uses, and you need to be able to show that you fully understand the author's argument before agreeing or disagreeing with it. So essentially, up until this point, you were supposed to reserve judgment on a work until you could fully understand what all the details of what an author was saying. So in this week, there are actually 11 rules for analytical reading that Adler and Van Doren give us. We're only going to cover the first 5, and then next week we'll cover the remaining 6. So in your worksheet, you should be filling out right here, what are the purposes of analytical reading, and I'm going to go into the stages, and after each stage we'll usually have a practice, so you may have to go back and forth in your worksheet a little bit. All right, so rule 1. All right, you must know what kind of book you're reading. All right, so this kind of sounds like we're harking back to inspectional reading a bit. This week, Adler and Van Doren tell you that there's 2 types of books. There's a practical book, which is how to do something. It's a basic way to think of it is sort of like an instruction manual, or like going to WikiHow, they give you step-by-step directions. Now, that may or may not be how the book is formulated, but it's practical in the sense it tells you how to do something. Theoretical is more of explaining about why something is that way, or how something came about. Okay, so what I want you to do is read pages 65 through 70 in Adler and Van Doren. If you have an ebook, that might be practical versus theoretical books in chapter 6. That's where I want you to start. And as you read through, you might realize, okay, there's a little bit more to determining if a book is practical or theoretical than what I thought. So I want you to read these pages, and then after you've read them, from what is said in the book, explain in the worksheet whether how to read a book is a practical or theoretical book. So this would be practice number 1. So what I would do is pause the video, complete this activity, and when you're done, come back. All right, so moving on to the second rule, state the unity of the whole book in a single sentence or at most a few sentences or a short paragraph. So in a nutshell, rule 2 is what is the main idea of the book? Okay, so how to find a main idea. There's 4 questions that you can ask, and they're on pages 46 through 47. You may want to dog-ear this section or highlight it or write out these questions on a sticky note so that you have easy access to these in the future. And these are really good questions to ask of any of the articles that we read in class as well. If you're ever struggling to understand what an author is saying, going, what's the purpose of this article? I don't understand. Stop and ask these questions and see if it helps you pinpoint the main idea. So you can ask yourself, what is the book about as a whole, or the article? Okay, what's the main objective or goal that this author has? 2, what is being said in detail and how? So what does the author spend a lot of time describing? What are they always giving examples of or evidence of? Is the book or article true in whole or part? So where do you agree or disagree with the author and why? And what of it? I kind of call this the so what. Why is the author telling us this? And maybe why does the author think this is significant? And maybe how is it significant to you as the reader? Okay. All right, so rule number 3. Set forth the major parts of the book and show how these are organized into a whole by being ordered to one another and to the unity of the whole. Okay, so to simplify that a little bit, it's basically saying every book or article has a main idea, and the sections of that article or book are all going to relate and tie together to represent the main idea. Okay, that's what's meant by unity. So in a nonfiction article or a book, the unity will always be the primary idea the author wants to convey. If you're reading a work of fiction, the unity will always be what happened. It's going to be the plot of the book. Okay. Now, this rule, there's a key difference between what's being said here and inspectional reading, because in inspectional reading, you're just getting the broad picture, but with analytical reading, you're going to start to go in deeper and really understand how do the different sections support the main idea. Okay. Now, realize too, the unity of a work can be said in more than one way. So there's more than one right answer that you can give for this, okay? So realize there's some flexibility in wording and stuff. You're kind of like, with this rule, think of it this way. You're summarizing what the whole book is about. All right, so I want us to practice some analytical reading here. So really with this rule, you should be able to outline the whole book and explain how each part relates to the other. But because we haven't read any book in its entirety yet in this class, I just want you to practice it on a smaller scale. So I want you to read chapter 7 in Adler and Van Doren and outline this chapter. Now, these 2 authors, they're very nice. They give you lots of headings in the chapters already. If you want to use their headings to help you outline, you may, but you can't just give me a rundown of the headings from their chapter, okay? I want you to give me a little more information. So if you do use their headings, make sure to then explain how does that section relate to the unity of the whole chapter. If you use your own headings, again, make sure to explain how does that section relate to the unity of the whole chapter. So this part right here, this is what I'm really going to be looking for and kind of, grading you on, essentially, with this worksheet is, do you explain how one section relates to the next? All right, so go ahead, pause this video, and then when you're done, come back. So for the 4th rule, you are to find out what the author's problems were. All right, so that may sound a little strange. What this means is, what was the author's purpose in writing this piece? Okay, so realize every piece of writing is always written as a response to something, and you're seeing the result or answer of a question or problem that the author had. Okay? Now, this may or may not be the case with a fictional work or like a novel or short story, but for every non-fictional piece, this will be true. So of all the articles we read in the class, those authors are writing them in response to a question or problem that they encountered. So the main question to ask yourself is, what is the question the author is trying to answer by writing this piece? Okay, so here's the quote from Adler and Van Doren. It is your task as a reader to formulate the questions as precisely as you can. So that means the original questions that the author had. What were those original questions? You should be able to state the main question that the book tries to answer, and you should be able to state the subordinate questions if the main question is complex and has many parts. All right. So again, this is like for a book, maybe even some of the articles we read, there may be more than one question the author was seeking to respond to. Now, sometimes authors will state their problems directly. They may tell you what the problem was. So if they do that, it'll often be in like a preface, an abstract, an introduction, right in the beginning of their work. Now, if the author doesn't state their problem, and this is not unusual, there are some questions you can ask yourself to help you identify it. So you may want to write down these questions or take a screenshot of them. And again, if you're ever struggling to find the main idea of an article, these 3 questions will help you with that. So just ask yourself, what is the author trying to fix? Second could be, what problem, controversy, or issue does the author raise as their main topic? And then third, does the author talk about difficulties they had in relation to the subject they're writing on? Maybe problem with understanding something, or maybe the difficulty in handling a situation, or maybe not finding an answer. Sometimes a difficulty an author had will serve as the inspiration for writing their piece, and they'll tell you about that in the very beginning of their paper. Okay, now this is another point where reading and writing connect. So if you've ever had to do a research paper, you may recognize this. In research writing, you are always responding to a problem or question that you have, and then writing about the result or answer that you found. So again, being a good reader will help you be a good writer, and especially a good writer of research, which is part of what we'll be doing in this class, especially midway through in a few weeks. All right, so you have another practice set. What I want you to do is identify what the problem is that Adler and Van Doren are responding to when they wrote this book, How to Read a Book. Okay, so explain how you arrive at your answer and kind of defend it. So pause the video, complete that section of the worksheet, and then come back for the last rule.